In this video, I'd like to show you how to use the xamDataChart in order to read real-time data. Now, before I get into the code, I want to show you a few things about this sample. Notice that on the screen here, I have a xamDataChart. We also have a legend, a couple sliders, and a couple buttons. Now, to show the data chart really in its best light, I'm going to go to some ridiculous extremes. With this slider here, what I can do is I can bring this all the way up to about 50,000 data points. And I can click on this Add Points button. You'll notice that it added 50,000 data points to the chart. And so at this point, what I can do is then click Start, and now real-time data is being fed into the chart, managing about 50,000 individual data points. So you see the performance is pretty good. In fact, what I can do is I can take the interval slider here and even bring it up to a faster clip and bring in data at every 10 milliseconds, and you'll see that the chart continues to respond well. So if I play with these sliders a little bit, you can see a few things. Now, based off the legend, you can see that there's 3 different series being tracked on the chart as well. So I'm going to bring the data points down a lot, and so let's bring it down to like 300 here, even further, so 100. And I'll just stop this so you can see. So even though we're bringing in 50,000 data points, it's actually 3 times that because of the series. And each one of these nodes has a tooltip, and so there's quite a bit of information being used within this chart, and it's performing quite well. I'll start this back up again, and you can see that based off of the changes here, you can make it a little smoother, going at 69 milliseconds and on and on. So if I bring this up to say 35,000, it'll continue to load the data in until it fills up with the full 30,000. Now, this sample is built in order to be simplistic enough for us to deal with within the video, yet I'll show you all the things that you need to have in place to make it relevant to a real-world type of scenario. So with that, let's drop in to Visual Studio. So let's begin by reviewing the XAML. So obviously the first thing that we need to do is bring in the correct namespace, and so we'll bring in infragistics.controls.charts, and that will expose the xamDataChart for us. So there are some styles that are necessary in order to define to give the series the correct look. And if you download the code, you can go through each one of the items here for the styles for those series. But it basically gives the different series the different color and the different glyphs that show up on a single data point. The next thing that we have here is the layout grid, and it's got just some standard settings in order to have some column definitions. What we're most concerned about is the xamDataChart here, and also the legend. Down here at the bottom, this separate grid houses the sliders and the buttons, and the XAML that defines those isn't really that important, but how we interact with them is. And so when we get into the code, you'll see how that happens. So we've got the chart. It has some standard dimensions set up, and the style is being brought in from a static resource on the page and being bound up to the legend control here. So you'll see here I've instantiated a legend. It's getting its style from the resources on the page as well, and giving it the height and width. So you'll probably see this type of markup often. The real key to the chart, though, is the axes in the series. So for the axis here, we've got the x-axis, and it's being bound up to ticker items that are being exposed through the view model to the chart, and we're just giving it the label of column 0, which is basically the date, and then a default y-axis. After we have those defined, then we have the 3 series that come in. So we have the high, low, and close values within the series, and each one is set up pretty much exactly the same way. We're binding to the legend, and the axis is here. We have the different type of marker types. The item source comes from the ticker items, and then we're grabbing the value from each one of the different columns that are appropriate. And then lastly, we're defining a tooltip within the series, and you can see this is just a string format in order to grab the values out of the source data. So that's a review of the XAML. So let's take a look now at the code behind. This sample uses a view model, so the code that's in the code behind is actually quite limited. So up at the top, I'm declaring a variable for the real-time data view model, and when the page is loaded, then we'll create an instance of that view model class. Now to begin, I'm passing in the interval value coming from the slider. So it starts off at 30 milliseconds, and so whatever that initial value is, it's being passed down into the view model. Setting the data context of this control to the view model, and then there's a few items here that we need to hook up to the view model based off of user interaction. So to toggle the data feed, I have a button here. It's a start-stop button, and we'll go down in the view model and toggle whether or not the timer is running in the background in order to provide data to the data source. When we do add points, it will fill up the data source with the amount of selected data. So based off of the data point slider, I started off at like 500 and then moved it up to 50,000. Whatever the value is coming from that slider, it will fill the data source with that amount of items for the chart. So here is the method in order to do the changing of the value for the interval slider and the data point slider, and we're simply calling methods within the view model, appropriately named change interval and change data point, and just passing in the latest value from the slider and into those methods. So you'll see how this all ties together and the implementation when we take a look at the view model. So the way this works is that we'll use a dispatch timer in order to run in the background to take data that's been generated, so some sample data that's been generated in the beginning, and then at the certain interval take either one item or a particular number of items and add it into a data source that's bound up to the grid. So the dispatch timer's job is to just tick through, and every time a tick happens, grab a certain amount of data and put it into the data source. Now the ticker buffer class is responsible for managing the data as it comes through the application. So the generated data will be accessible through the ticker buffer class, and then every time the timer is asking for more information, it will grab items out of the cache and put it into a data source for the chart. To see how this works together, let's start off by taking a look at the constructor. So we have our dispatch timer, and I'm creating a new instance of that. Every time the timer ticks, we'll come down and run a method, which we'll look at in a moment. And then I'm just calling change interval here from the constructor because the slider will also need to call this method. And so all this method is doing is updating the data feed timer interval value based off of the value that comes in from that slider. And I'm just formatting it here into a time span. And then there's a text property that reports the value back up to the view. And so I'm doing raise property changed event on interval text. So let's take a look at that. You can simply see here that it's taking the data feed timer interval value, the milliseconds of it, and formatting it in an appropriate string to show up onto the view. So back to the constructor, that sets up the data feed timer for us. And then we have the ticker buffer, and I'm creating an instance of that ticker buffer and loading it with this historical data. So let's start with this class here and then move backwards. So the data loader class, its only job is to create an observable collection of an instance of row objects. And you can see here there's quite a bit of data here. So this is taking place of any sort of service or database call that you might have for your application. So back over to the view model, we have that historical data that's generated by the data loader, and then we go into the ticker buffer class. Now you can get all of the details about this class by downloading the code and taking a look at it. I'm going to go over it here pretty quickly, but I just want to give you an idea of what it's responsible for doing. So based off of the data point count, what we'll do is generate a number of different items within a historical buffer. So if we come down to generate, you can see we're creating all of those records and making them available for the data chart. So we have the generated store and then also a data source that's linked up directly to the chart. So once that data is generated, then you'll see this method being used every time that the timer ticks. And what it does is it takes data out of the generated cache and puts it into a buffer again for the chart. And it's also responsible for clearing out items that aren't displayed within the chart as well. So it kind of does some house cleaning also. So back to the view model. So we have our ticker buffer. And so we start off by calling the add data method, which is responsible for loading up the data source with the appropriate number of items based off of what's chosen by the UI. So the default value for the data point count is being used here. And if we come to add data, you can see that we're just going into our ticker buffer, adding records from historical data based off of the amount that we're giving, and doing a raise property changed event here for the ticker items. Now the reason I'm doing that is because now the data source for the chart has changed. It's added some items to that value. So by doing a raise property event change, that will update the view. So as the timer is continually running in the background, the tick event will be fired and this method will be run. And so what's happening at this point is we're calling the add data method and simply adding one item to the data source. You could change this to some sort of convention. At this point, I'm just adding a new data point every time it ticks. But it's just calling the add data method in order to add in a single item from the historical data into the data source. Now there's just a few more methods required in order to fill out the rest of this view model. The change data point count is a pretty simple method as well, and this is what's hooked up to the data point slider. So as we decide we want more items loaded into the chart, we change the value in the slider, and when it recognizes that change, you can see here, change data point count from the slider value changed. Then we'll go to the ticker buffer, update the data point count to whatever comes in from the slider, and then do raise property change event for the data point count text. And raising this event is necessary so that the UI can be updated with the amount of the items that are currently within the chart. So it's just doing a string format based off of the ticker buffer data point count. Now initially when we load up the chart, we need to provide data for it. So fill data source is the method that's called when someone clicks on that button. So when you say add data points, it will take a look at the amount of data points that you want based off of the value on the slider and call fill data source. And again, what this is doing is just acting as a wrapper for add data and taking a look at the ticker buffer data point count. So whatever you've increased or decreased that value to, it'll pull it out of the buffer and add those data within to the data source. And the last one here is just the start and stop button. So we can take a look at the timer and find out if it's enabled. If it is enabled, then we'll stop it and we'll switch the start stop text to start. Otherwise, we'll do the other thing and we'll start it and we'll switch the text to read stop. So once again, just to review, as the page is loaded up, we call fill data source based off of the value that comes in from the slider, and it loads up the data source from the historical data and provides that to the grid. I can change the values here on the slider, so I could change this to say 15,000 and then click add points, and that fills up the data source with the amount of items that I want. I can click the start button in order to bring in the live data, and so what this did was it started the timer, and every time it ticks it'll go through and add a single data item to the series. The other slider I have available to me is the intervals, and so I can bring this up to update say every 10 milliseconds, or I can slow it down quite a bit and only update it every 100 milliseconds. Well, thanks for joining me on this screencast. I hope this gets you started on using the xamDataChart with real-time data.
Infragistics. On the web at infragistics.com.